Nobody saw her coming. That was kind of the point. When the Miami Open draw was released and tennis fans scrolled through the bracket searching for the names they recognized, the champions, the top seeds, the familiar faces plastered across sponsorship banners and highlight reels, Eala was just another name buried somewhere in the lower half of a 128-player draw. Unseeded. Unrecognized by the committee that mattered most. Essentially invisible. And that invisibility was the first mistake the WTA ever made with her. What happens when a sport tells you that you're not quite there is something that happens to a player when the sport they have dedicated their entire life to looks them in the eye and says, not yet. Something ignites. Something that no ranking algorithm, no seeding committee, no bureaucratic process can measure or predict or prepare for. Eala had been building towards something throughout the entire 2024 season. Quietly, methodically, almost stubbornly, winning matches she was not supposed to win, dismantling players with better rankings, more experience, and bigger reputations. Anyone paying close enough attention could see it. The forehand that cracked like a whip. The serve that landed with surgical precision. The court awareness that made her seem perpetually one step ahead of where the ball was supposed to go. She was a Filipino teenager navigating the brutal grind of professional women's tennis, and she was doing things on court that veterans twice her age could not figure out. But the seeding committee was not paying close enough attention. They ran their calculations, consulted their numbers, and concluded that she did not belong among the top 32 protected names at one of the most prestigious tournaments in the sport. No seed meant no protection. No protection meant a brutal early draw. No recognition meant no story, at least not yet. What the committee failed to understand, what algorithms never truly capture, is that a player like Eala does not simply show up to compete.
She shows up to prove something.
Every single time. The first round when she walked onto that court for her opening match, you could feel it before she struck a single ball. There was a deliberate intensity in the way she moved, a controlled, focused energy, like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. She was not nervous. She was ready. What followed was one of the cleanest, most clinical performances you are likely to see from any player, seeded or otherwise, in the opening round of a tournament of this magnitude. She did not simply win. She dominated. Her opponent, ranked comfortably above her on the WTA ladder, had no answers. The match was never genuinely competitive. It was a statement delivered in straight sets, and the statement was simple. You got this wrong. The groundswell begins. Then came the second round, and something interesting started happening. A few people noticed. Not the mainstream tennis media. Not the broadcast booth. Not the analysts who spend their mornings debating the top 10. Just the people who follow the sport closely enough to recognize when something unusual is beginning to unfold. Clips started circulating, short videos of that forehand, that serve, the way she moved around the baseline with a quiet ferocity that felt completely at odds with her unseeded status. A question began appearing in comment sections and tennis forums. Who is this girl? Why does she look like she's angry at the entire tournament? The honest answer was that she kind of was. Not in a destructive or self-defeating way. Not in a way that was pulling her off her game or clouding her judgment. More like a controlled fury. The kind of deep, sustainable motivation that comes from spending months and years being told through the language of rankings and seedings and committee decisions that you're almost good enough, that you are close but not quite there, that you are a prospect, a name to watch, a potential upset waiting to happen. Not a threat. Never a threat. She was becoming a very serious threat indeed. The sport catches up by the third round. The casual tennis world had started to pay attention. Eala's name was no longer only for the hardcore followers. Commentators who had genuinely never mentioned her before were suddenly trying to sound as though they had been tracking her career all along. Analysts were pulling up her statistics, her match history, her trajectory across the previous 12 months, trying to explain to their audiences how she had somehow been missed. The answer, though nobody was comfortable saying it plainly, was that the system had missed her too. The round of 16 appearance changed the entire conversation, not just about Eala, but about the tournament itself. Because the Miami Open is not a small event. It is not a challenger tournament where upsets go unnoticed and nobody outside the tennis bubble registers what happened. Miami is one of the biggest stages in women's tennis. The draw is packed with Grand Slam champions, former world number ones, players with millions of followers and endorsement portfolios that dwarf some small nation's GDP. And right there in the quarterfinal conversation was an unseeded Filipino teenager whom the seeding committee had essentially written off before the first ball was struck. The institutional reckoning, the backlash against the WTA, began building slowly, and then all at once. Tennis journalists who had been watching quietly finally put their thoughts into print. Former players, people who understood from direct personal experience what it meant to be underestimated by the system, began speaking publicly about what they were witnessing. Social media did what social media does, amplifying the conversation and pushing the question into spaces where it could no longer be avoided or ignored. Why wasn't Eala seeded? Who made that call? What exactly are we measuring when we assign these rankings? And are we measuring the right things? Those were not rhetorical questions. People wanted actual answers. The seeding committee, which normally operates in complete and comfortable obscurity, suddenly found itself at the center of a very public reckoning. Because the uncomfortable truth that Eala's run had exposed was this: the ranking system that women's tennis uses to organize its competitive hierarchy is built on historical data. It rewards consistency accumulated over time. It values what a player has already done, not necessarily what a player is in the process of becoming. And for a teenager in the middle of a genuine, rapidly accelerating breakthrough, someone whose recent form is screaming that something extraordinary is happening right now, in this moment, that system is almost structurally designed to miss them. Eala was not a product of a slow, steady, methodical climb up the rankings. She was a comet, and the instruments the WTA used to track players were not built to detect comets. The sponsors, the broadcasters, and the silence tournament directors at Miami were watching all of this unfold with a complicated mixture of emotions. On one hand, an unseeded player making a deep run is genuinely valuable. It creates storylines. It generates interest. It gives casual viewers a compelling reason to tune in beyond simply watching the expected top seeds execute the predetermined narrative. On the other hand, the story had taken a turn that was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved in organizing the draw, because the conversation was no longer solely about Eala's talent. It had become about institutional failure, about a system that had looked at one of the most exciting young players in the sport and concluded, based on data that was already becoming outdated, that she did not belong in the serious conversation. Sponsors were paying attention. Broadcasters were paying attention. And most importantly, the fans were paying attention, and they were not satisfied by the committee's silence. There was no formal statement, no explanation of the methodology, no acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, just quiet, which in its own way was the loudest possible admission that the criticism was landing exactly where it was aimed. The players themselves began speaking up, and this was perhaps the most powerful dimension of the entire story. Eala's peers, young women who had practiced alongside her, who had faced her across the net in smaller tournaments, who had felt firsthand in match situations where her game was capable of, came forward publicly and said what everyone watching already knew. She should have been seeded. She belonged in that conversation from the very beginning. The skill was never the question. The system simply was not looking in the right direction. The case built point by point. Every match Eala won at Miami was simultaneously doing two things. It was advancing her through the draw, obviously, but it was also building a legal case in the court of public sporting opinion. Point by point, game by game, set by set, she was constructing an argument that no ranking algorithm could refute. You said, I wasn't elite. Watch this. You said, I wasn't a threat. Watch this. You said my name didn't belong on the seeded list. Watch every single one of these matches, and then tell me again that your numbers were right. The broadcast coverage shifted noticeably as the tournament progressed. Early in the draw, her matches received limited airtime and minimal analysis, the kind of perfunctory coverage that unseeded players always receive, because the assumption is that they will not be around long enough to matter. But by the time she was deep in the draw, the cameras could not get enough. The commentators were effusive, almost apologetic in their enthusiasm, as though they were trying to compensate in real time for the weeks and months and years they had not been talking about her. She had forced her way into the spotlight. Not through hype or marketing or a carefully managed social media strategy. Through the oldest and most undeniable currency in professional sport, winning. The questions that will not go away. What Eala did at Miami was bigger than one tournament result. It opened a conversation that women's tennis had needed to have for some time about how young players are evaluated, about whether the current ranking system adequately captures momentum and trajectory, or whether it is too anchored to historical data to recognize a player in the middle of a genuine breakthrough, about whether the seeding process, which has real and significant consequences for who faces whom and when, is as rigorous and as fair as the sport requires it to be. These are not easy questions, and they do not have quick or comfortable answers. Bureaucracies, especially in sport, move slowly. Changes to ranking methodologies do not happen because of one tournament, however dramatic or compelling. But the questions are now impossible to dismiss in a way they simply were not before Miami. Eala made sure of that. What gets lost in the conversation, and here is the thing that sometimes gets buried when we talk about systems and rankings and institutional failures and the mechanics of how a seeding committee makes its decisions. Behind all of it is just a girl. A teenager from the Philippines who fell in love with tennis, who put in the hours and the work and the sacrifice that nobody photographs or broadcasts or writes articles about, who traveled the world competing in tournaments most people never heard of, in front of crowds that barely filled the stands, building a game that was quietly and steadily becoming something extraordinary. She did not ask for the controversy. She did not need the narrative about the seeding committee's mistake to motivate her. She was already motivated. She had always been motivated. The unseeding simply gave everyone else a reason to finally pay attention to something that had been there all along, visible to anyone who had cared to look. That is the real legacy of what happened at Miami. Not just a stunning run by an unseeded teenager. Not just the public embarrassment of a ranking committee that got it badly wrong. It is the reminder that talent does not wait for permission. It does not wait for a system to recognize it, or a committee to validate it, or an algorithm to finally catch up to what everyone watching in real time already knows. Sometimes the most dangerous player in the draw is the one nobody is talking about. Eala was that player. The WTA found out the hard way. And the rest of the tennis world is going to be talking about her for a very long time.